What's the last honest video game you played? I don't mean to insinuate the use of honesty by developers in an insidious or disingenuous way necessarily. It could be that a game intentionally misleads the player in order to set up a narrative reveal or gameplay change partway through. Honesty in games comes in many forms and can be used in both good and bad ways. But honestly, isn't it nice to sometimes just play a game that is exactly what it appears to be? Ladies and gentlemen, this is Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine. It's kind of ironic how straightforward Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine story is, considering the extremely complex and lore-driven world in which it takes place. For those who are unaware, or are only tangentially familiar with Warhammer 40,000, you probably know it as a science fiction-based tabletop game, played by weirdos like me. And to those people, I say, shut up, whatever. Yeah, say that to a Space Marine and he'll mess you up. Anyway, it isn't for everyone, so I'll try and be as general and as brief as I can with my overview of the game's opening premise. Essentially, the story revolves around a single planet named Graia, which is what's known as a Forge World. Forge Worlds in 40k are essentially worlds that are controlled by a faction called the Adeptus Mechanicus. The Adeptus Mechanicus are described as, quote, the keeper and manufacturers of technology for the Imperium of mankind, end quote. So basically, they make all the tech, weapons, and tanks, etc. for humankind, who are now known as the Imperium of Man. When this Forge world is invaded and overrun by orcs, one of the many enemies of mankind, the Imperium decides that orbital bombardment is not an option due to the planet holding valuable technological commodities. So instead, they send in the Ultramarines. Ultramarines are an elite type of Space Marine trooper, and a key weapon for the Imperium in the fight against their many threats. Of course, not all is as it initially appears when they arrive and try to take back the planet, but we'll come back to the intricacies of the plot later. The point is, these elements are super simple to understand, even if the context is missing. The player gets what the threat is, and they know who they are in this story, even if they don't know exactly why. Normally here I would analyse various narrative techniques and the use of ludology to further inspect the game's narrative and themes, but Space Marine isn't really that kind of game. Most of the time, characters tell you what's happening through short cutscenes of expositionary dialogue. It doesn't even feel lazy or poorly executed, just really basic. You'll see what I mean as we continue. But luckily for now, none of this really matters anyway, because the second you take control of protagonist Titus, after the game's opening, the story takes a backseat. What you're seeing here is the distillation of a game concept in its purest and most honest form. There are no puzzles to solve, no NPCs to protect, the whole game is just about killing everything. I've spoken in previous videos about 40k's use of massive scale and its ideas and concepts, and it's here again in full force. The general premise in the narrative is that they have sent 3 Ultramarines to take out around 1 million orcs. Let's put that in perspective. That means that if each of them killed an equal amount of orcs, it would be almost the equivalent to taking out the entire current population of Iceland each. And it's not as if they're expected to do this with rests in between either. They're expected to land on the planet and just keep killing orcs until they're wiped out. As expected with such a task laid out before them, these Ultramarines are some tough cookies. Oh, man. I guess he didn't make... Oh. But don't let that lull you into a false sense of security. The orcs are no pushovers either, and it's easy to get overwhelmed by their sheer numbers. In fact, Space Marine often plays with the idea of the power fantasy, lulling the player into thinking they're invincible, and then upping the stakes. It's in this balanced dynamic that Space Marine really finds its rhythm. While it might look like a full-on hack and slash meets Gears of War murder party, there's a little more to the combat in Space Marine than initially meets the eye. Essentially, you have your health and a rechargeable shield. After damaging certain enemy types enough, you are able to stun them with particular attacks. Once stunned, an awesomely brutal finisher can be performed, which will replenish your health bar. However, the crucial piece of information here is that there is no invulnerability frames on the finishers, meaning that enemies are still free to damage you when you are performing them. This leads to a sort of reaction-based risk-reward system in the heat of battle and creates some genuinely tense moments. A lot of people have noted the similarity in this system to those seen in Doom 2016, and that's a fine comparison. However, I would argue that what sets the system in Space Marine apart is the ability to be damaged to the point of death at almost any time. In Doom 2016, when you're almost dead, you're shooting everything and moving constantly, waiting for that flashing enemy to pop up. Once they appear and you make it to them in time, you are afforded a momentary respite, which, while it only lasts a literal second or two, feels like an entire day off in Doom time. This is the case because the player cannot be damaged when performing a finisher in Doom, so it brings with it a momentary relief. However, in Space Marine, that relief is even more fleeting, or maybe even non-existent, as performing a finisher doesn't mean you are guaranteed to survive. This often means that the entire way through the animation, you are intensely watching your health bar, waiting for it to fill as the animation finishes. As well as this, there is also Fury Mode. Unlocked a short way into the game and upgraded throughout, Fury Mode is essentially an all-out rage mode, which increases your damage output and constantly replenishes your health for a short duration. Damaging enemies charges the Fury meter, and once it's full it can be unleashed. It can also be upgraded later in the game to be used as a kind of focus meter which slows down time when aiming, but I personally rarely used it for this, and instead favoured it as a last resort in close quarter situations. However, once again in keeping with the game's previously mentioned MO, the use of Fury Mode doesn't make you invincible, and death can come just as quickly as before you triggered it if you get overwhelmed. But this is not to say that the game is hard in general. In fact, despite one or two deaths and a few mildly challenging sections, the game is generally fun because you are so powerful and not because it prioritizes the player succeeding over adversity in its design philosophies. Sure, you have to be careful that you don't bite off more orc horde than you can chew, but once you find a rhythm, it definitely becomes a power trip. Even if you die more often than you feel you should be, you're still killing at least 150 enemies or so for every one time they kill you, and this pretty much also goes for the game's hard mode too. In terms of the escalation of both narrative stakes and the gameplay scenarios, Space Marine does a pretty good job, with new enemies and weapons slowly being drip-fed to the player, and many varied arenas of combat in which to use them. And speaking of weapons, there are a good variety here, though there were a few I gravitated towards and a few I ignored. The bolter rifle soon becomes old reliable, and is there any finer tool of destruction than the Thunderhammer when it's combined with the jump pack? Such qualities also extend to the enemy variation and escalation, although unfortunately not to the same extent, as, like the story itself, these elements do struggle a little in the game's final act. Speaking of the game's final act, it's important to go over what happens here, as even though it isn't Space Marine's most memorable or well-defined area, the events in late game do serve to affect gameplay. Even though there isn't much to spoil given the relative lack of importance that Space Marine places on its story, and the fact that the game is now around a decade old, I'll still put a time code up here if you want to avoid any spoilers and going completely blind. So once on the planet and after walking around and murdering 1,000 orcs, Titus eventually finds Drogon, the Inquisitor who had originally called for help during the initial orc invasion. Inquisitors are essentially the secret police of the Imperium of Man, charged with rooting out corruption and heresy in its ranks. So Drogon, who is totally trustworthy and in no way clearly full of shit, basically orders Titus around for a while and tells him to get a power source from a reactor deep beneath one of the Mechanicus structures. Turns out that apparently there's a giant weapon on this Forge world that can wipe out all the orcs in one go. Well, that's convenient. After yet more orc murdering, Titus eventually reaches the power source, but due to an altercation with a large orc boss, its housing becomes damaged, and so he has to remove it and place it in a new casing. This is relevant because it exposes the Ultramarine to what is known in 40k as warp energy. Without getting too deep into things, the warp is a dimension that is overlaid on our own, and is often accessed by the Imperium in order to utilize its powerful energy or its existence as a means of faster than light travel. Unfortunately, however, it is also the realm of chaos, and the source of demonic entities and a terrible corrupting power, which constantly threatens the Imperium and all other life. After Titus survives this encounter, a point is made that he shouldn't have lived after an exposure like that, let alone be absolutely fine.
The Inquisitor insisted you could not have survived.
Well, I did.
An interesting plot point that is very underplayed and unfortunately exists as a setup for a future sequel that will now never happen. So after yet more orcs slaying and errand running, eventually Titus sets off the device which is supposed to wipe out all of the orcs on the planet. It doesn't.
Surprise, motherfucker!
Here come the forces of chaos, a demonic legion hell-bent on the corruption and destruction of all life. So now we're in a three-way conflict. Also, turns out that Inquisitor Doran was in fact dead the whole time and was simply a puppet of chaos. From here, Titus must defeat the chaos forces and save the planet from corruption. Obviously, he succeeds, but then the mystery of why he was never corrupted by the warp is brought up again, in a very cliffhangery, guess we'll find out in one of our continuing adventures kind of way.
You are certain of this charge?
Captain Titus has been corrupted by Chaos, Inquisitor Thrax.
I am no heretic!
You lie! Only an agent of Chaos could withstand such warp exposure.
I sent the demon to oblivion. But did you have unholy assistance? We must know. You will submit to my authority, Captain, or the Inquisition must conclude that you have corrupted every Ultramarine under your command, not to mention those who stand at your side.
Ignore his threats. Come on.
The Inquisition will destroy you, Mira, and the Ultramarines will be forever dishonored. Leave my brothers and the Lieutenant alone. I will come with you. I do not know why I can resist the touch of chaos, but I swear I will discover the truth.
We will discover many truths, Space Marine.
It might sound like I'm being flippant, but it really isn't the worst story ever told. It's just very straightforward, and doesn't ever seem concerned with overcomplicating matters. So how do these events affect gameplay? Well, initially the appearance of chaos seems like a welcome way to shake things up. After all, despite some enemy variation and event escalation, you've basically spent the entire game killing just orcs at this point. While it does vary things a little, making the game a more ranged affair, as many of the new enemy types prefer attacking from distance, they aren't really enough to make a huge difference. Also, the game's pacing seems to suffer a little after the introduction of chaos. Kinda like they'd built up to this key plot moment, and then weren't quite sure how to get from there to the end of the game. Also, speaking of the end of the game, the final boss is a real disappointment, existing as essentially an interactive cutscene instead of a boss fight. In fact, the lack of boss fights in general feels like a weird omission. There's basically one boss fight in the whole game, and it's relatively basic. While not enough to mar the game completely, it's just kind of weird that in a game where combat is clearly the strongest part, they didn't prioritize the inclusion of interesting and varied boss design. So let's talk about game length and replay value. Space Marine isn't a long game by any standards. Even on hard, it probably won't take you much longer than 6 to 8 hours to complete. Unfortunately, other than its fun combat, it also has very little replay value, other than some audio log collectibles. There's unfortunately no New Game Plus or harder difficulty to unlock. All of this sort of adds credence to the theory that the game may have been a little rushed, or at the very least pressed for time during its production, as these sort of things seem like a no-brainer, even in 2011 when the game first launched. On the plus side, it did launch with a pretty good multiplayer suite, which even saw DLC maps released. There were several PvP and co-op horde style modes, which could be played private or with strangers, and despite not being the best multiplayer of its era, it saw a pretty healthy player base back when the game first launched. However, while it's still technically possible to play these modes, at least on the PC version, I was unfortunately unable to find games on the several occasions that I tried. I checked around on some forums and heard that there's a tiny player base of around 100 still playing, but if this is true, I couldn't locate them. In terms of presentation, Space Marine is somewhat of a mixed bag. It originally released in 2011 on PS3, Xbox 360 and PC, and looked a notch above okay at the time. Nowadays, whether running maxed out on a PC or being played on an old console, it's clear that visually there were always varied results, with some areas displaying bland textures and washed out colour palettes. Strangely though, this isn't the case for all locations, some of which display great lighting and interesting particle effects. There's also some stellar animation work, especially when performing some of the game's many execution attacks. But all in all, it kind of feels like sacrifices were made in the visual domain in order to facilitate fluid performance, especially when considering that many of the game's encounters involve a lot of enemies on screen at once. Still, regardless of some spotty visuals here and there, the game's art direction maintains that majestic, large-scale 40k flair that the franchise is known for, successfully mixing space opera, science fiction, industrial design, religious iconography, and even some fantasy elements. Such mixed results are not found, however, in the game's sound, which, well, listen to it.
Brothers thought the same, traitor. Their corpses.
The voice acting's also pretty good, with a cast of mainly film talent being led by none other than the official that guy from Stuff. Also, the score's great too, with some memorable orchestral work and standout tracks towards the midpoint of the game. Regarding bugs, Space Marine is a relative non-offender, with some minor collision issues and a few other small problems here and there. I did come across a few weapon swapping issues too, with certain guns that wouldn't select, or even wouldn't fire once selected in a few cases. But these were few and far between, and were always fixed with a checkpoint reload. Also, speaking of checkpoints, while most of them are fine, there are a few that are spaced a little too far apart, or just placed at weird times, leading to a little bit of unnecessary frustration here and there if you die. So, I mentioned earlier that this game sets up sequels that will now more than likely never come to fruition. So let's talk about that for a moment. Unfortunately, despite generally positive reviews, Space Marine underperformed pretty badly, and along with the subsequent closure of its publisher THQ a short time later, it is remembered historically as a beloved failure. This is such a shame for several reasons. While it undoubtedly has problems, Space Marine remains one of the best 40k games of that era. But more than this, it feels like a good first game that could have led to great sequels. Many developers say that the second game in the series is often the game they wanted to make when they made the first, but they didn't have the know-how, money or ability to execute on that vision the first time round. While this rule is in no way an absolute, I can feel how this would have come into play with Space Marine. It has some great elements and some amazing ideas that just maybe needed another game or two to percolate and mature. It's a real shame. So, when all is said and done, is Space Marine worth your time? I played this game when it originally launched, and back then I would have said that it was just okay. But playing it again in 2020, it's definitely left more of an impression. It's a game that's really just about gameplay, and a very specific type of gameplay at that. The strength of something this forthcoming and honest is that you know exactly what you're getting right from the start. If you're not enjoying yourself in the game's opening section, then you may as well sit this one out, because it really doesn't change much. For me, it's a game that I'll return to once every 5 years or so. I'll play through it, have some fun, kill a lot of things, remember all its flaws, and then forget about it until the cycle repeats. Ironically, as a fan of deep 40k lore and the universe in general, it's not actually these elements that appeal to me, even if I try and convince myself otherwise. Space Marine isn't trying to be highbrow, reinvent the wheel, or push the medium or the universe it calls home forward in any meaningful way. It's a game where you stomp your way through literally thousands of enemies and enjoy all the catharsis that brings. It won't stick with you much, and it's not an all-encompassing or enrapturing experience, but nevertheless it remains one of the better 40k games, especially of the generation in which it launched. If you have a spare 6 to 8 hours, and you like the idea of embodying a 7-foot murder machine on a quest to destroy a small country's population's worth of monsters, then there are definitely worse uses of your time. Add to this the fact that it can be picked up pretty cheap in various sales, and factor its existence as a game from almost a decade ago, meaning the specs required to run it are super low, and maybe it's just the palate cleanser you're looking for. It won't change the world, and it won't change your perspective on the third-person shooter, but if you're a fan of 40k, or just a fan of cathartic murder fests, you can do worse than Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine.